Eagle discovers 3 crying bear cubs 2 years later. The unbelievable happens. Welcome back to Emotion Tales, the stories. Don't forget to subscribe and let's dive into the story right now. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like a protective blanket, sheltering the secrets of Montana's Bitterroot Mountains from prying eyes. High above the pine-studded slopes, a magnificent golden eagle rode the thermal currents with practiced ease, her 8-foot wingspan barely twitching as she scanned the wilderness below. The locals called her Shadow, for her habit of gliding silently over the landscape like a guardian spirit, watchful and ever-present. Dr. Emma Harrison stood at her cabin's weathered deck, tracking the eagle's flight through her binoculars. As the resident wildlife biologist for the Bitterroot National Forest, she'd spent the past decades studying the region's golden eagle population, but Shadow had always been special. There was an intelligence in those fierce amber eyes that went beyond mere instinct, a complexity that had drawn Emma to document the bird's behavior with an almost obsessive dedication. "Another morning with your favorite lady?" Thomas Blackwood's gravelly voice carried across the crisp mountain air as he approached the cabin. The retired park ranger had been Emma's mentor when she first arrived in Montana, fresh from her doctorate studies at Oxford. Now in his 70s, he still patrolled these mountains like a watchful grandfather, though unofficially. "Shadow's acting different today," Emma replied, not lowering her binoculars. "She's been circling that same area for the past hour, breaking her usual hunting pattern." Thomas joined her at the railing, his weathered face creasing with interest. "Where?" "Near Black Bear Creek, just below the old avalanche site." Emma finally lowered the binoculars, turning to face her old friend. "Something's drawn her attention." "Bear territory," Thomas mused, stroking his silver beard. "Bit early for cubs, though." As if in response to his words, a distant sound carried across the valley, a plaintive cry that made both humans freeze. It was unmistakably the sound of bear cubs in distress. Emma was already moving, grabbing her emergency kit and radio from inside the cabin. Thomas followed suit, his movements still spry despite his age. "I'm coming with you," he stated, leaving no room for argument. "Sally's been tracking a female black bear in that area. Something about her seeming unwell." Sally Williams was the local veterinarian who specialized in wildlife care, and her observations were never to be taken lightly. As Emma and Thomas made their way down the well-worn trail, the morning mist began to lift, revealing the brutal beauty of early spring in the Bitterroots. The snow was still melting in patches, creating a patchwork landscape of white and emerging green. Shadow continued her vigil overhead, and Emma found herself following the eagle's flight path as much as the trail itself. After 20 minutes of careful hiking, they heard the cubs' cries more clearly, 3 distinct voices calling out in fear and hunger. "There," Thomas whispered, pointing to a small clearing ahead. The scene that greeted them made Emma's heart clench. A female black bear lay motionless near the base of a large pine tree, while 3 tiny cubs, no more than a few weeks old, huddled together nearby, crying for their mother. Shadow circled lower, landing on a branch above the scene with uncharacteristic boldness for a golden eagle. Emma approached carefully, her trained eye taking in the details. The mother bear showed no obvious signs of trauma, but her condition told a story of illness, likely the same condition Sally had observed. As she got closer, her suspicions were confirmed. The bear had succumbed to a severe case of pneumonia, leaving her cubs orphaned in the early spring wilderness. "Poor little ones," Thomas murmured, keeping his distance but already pulling out his satellite phone to call Sally. "They're too young to survive on their own." Emma was about to respond when something extraordinary happened. Shadow, the wild and typically aloof eagle, glided down from her perch to land near the cubs. Every instinct in Emma's body tensed, expecting the worst. Golden eagles were known to occasionally prey on very young animals. But Shadow did something that would challenge everything Emma thought she knew about wildlife behavior. The eagle approached the cubs with careful steps, her massive wings slightly spread in what almost appeared to be a protective posture. The cubs, driven by cold and hunger, didn't retreat. Instead, the smallest one, runt of the litter, actually wobbled toward Shadow, its cries softening to curious whimpers. "Thomas," Emma breathed, hardly daring to move. "Are you seeing this?" "I'm seeing it," he replied quietly, "but I'm not sure I'm believing it." Over the next hour, as they waited for Sally to arrive with proper transport for the cubs, Emma and Thomas witnessed something that would later fill pages of scientific journals and spark heated debates in wildlife biology circles. Shadow remained with the cubs, her protective behavior becoming more pronounced. When one of the cubs strayed too close to a steep drop-off, she actually herded it back with her wing, showing a gentleness that seemed impossible for a raptor of her size. Sally arrived with her team just as the morning sun had fully burned away the mist. "Well, this is a first," she commented, taking in the scene. "We've got space at the Wildlife Center, but—" She trailed off, watching Shadow's interaction with the cubs. "But we might be witnessing something unprecedented," Emma finished. "Something that could change how we understand interspecies relationships in the wild." What followed was a carefully orchestrated compromise between human intervention and natural behavior. The Wildlife Center constructed a special enclosure in a quiet corner of their facility, with plenty of outdoor space and natural features. Most importantly, it was open to the sky, allowing Shadow to come and go as she pleased. Emma named the cubs Storm, Mist, and Echo, inspired by their connection to Shadow and the misty morning of their rescue. Storm was the largest and most adventurous, always first to investigate new things in their enclosure. Mist, the middle cub, showed an unusual talent for climbing, often perching in spots that seemed more suited to an eagle than a bear. Echo, the smallest, became known for mimicking sounds, including an uncanny approximation of Shadow's distinctive call. To everyone's amazement, Shadow became a regular presence in their lives. She would arrive most mornings with small prey, rabbits, or fish, which she would share with the cubs. More fascinating still, she began demonstrating hunting techniques to them, diving dramatically in front of their enclosure to show how she caught prey. The cubs, especially Storm, would watch with rapt attention, later adapting these lessons into their own unique hunting style. "It's remarkable," Emma explained to a colleague 6 months later, as they observed Shadow teaching the growing cubs how to identify approaching storms by watching bird behavior. She's not just feeding them, she's teaching them survival skills. And they're learning, but not just becoming bears who think they're eagles. They're developing their own hybrid of skills. The cubs grew quickly, as bear cubs do, but their connection to Shadow remained strong. By the time they were yearlings, they had developed abilities that left researchers astounded. Storm could predict incoming weather changes hours before they arrived, having learned to read the same atmospheric signs that birds instinctively understand. Mist developed an extraordinary sense for safe paths through difficult terrain, often leading other animals away from danger during forest fires or floods. Echo's vocal mimicry expanded to include a range of bird calls, which she used to communicate with various forest creatures. Emma documented everything meticulously, though she kept some of the more incredible observations private, knowing they would strain scientific credibility. Like the time Storm led a lost hiker to safety by deliberately marking the easiest path down the mountain. Or when Mist positioned herself beneath a tree for hours, waiting patiently until she could help a trapped fox cub that had climbed too high. These weren't just bears anymore. They were something entirely new. As their second spring in the wild approached, Emma and her team prepared to fully release the cubs into the wilderness. They were already spending most of their time roaming freely, returning to the center only occasionally. Shadow remained a constant presence, now more of a companion than a guardian. It was during this transition period that the miracle happened. the event that would cement this unusual family's legacy in the annals of wildlife behavior. Emma was tracking the bear's movements one stormy afternoon when she heard it, the unmistakable cry of a bear cub in distress. But this time, she wasn't the first responder. Through her binoculars, she watched in amazement as Storm, Mist, and Echo converged on the source of the cries, moving with purpose through the difficult terrain. The scene they found was heartbreakingly familiar. A lone cub, recently orphaned, huddled beneath a fallen log. But what happened next brought tears to Emma's eyes. The three young bears, now nearly full-grown, approached the cub with the same gentle care that Shadow had shown them 2 years earlier. Echo used her specialized calls to soothe the frightened cub, while Storm and Mist worked together to create a protective barrier against the wind and rain. Above them, Shadow appeared, circling once before landing nearby. The family's reunion around this new orphan demonstrated everything they had learned about compassion, protection, and the breaking of natural boundaries. "It's a full circle," Thomas said softly, standing beside Emma as they observed from a safe distance. "They're passing on what they learned from Shadow." The new cub, whom they named Brooke, became the first of many young animals that this unusual family would help over the years. The three bears, while maintaining their natural bear behaviors, had developed an extraordinary capacity for nurturing other creatures. They seemed to have a special affinity for orphaned animals, often working in concert with Shadow to protect and guide them until they could survive on their own. Their story eventually caught the attention of wildlife documentarians, though Emma was careful to control how much information was shared. "Some things need to remain mysterious," she would say when pressed about the more incredible aspects of their behavior. "Nature still holds secrets that we're not meant to fully understand." As the years passed, the legend of Shadow and her bear cubs grew into something of a local myth. Hikers would report being led to safety by a bear during storms, or speak of hearing eagle calls that seemed to come from the forest floor. Wildlife researchers noted unusual patterns of interspecies cooperation in the area, centered around 3 distinctive black bears who moved with an eagle's awareness of the sky. Shadow remained a constant presence, though she grew older and flew less frequently. She would often be seen perched near her adopted family, watching with that same intelligent gaze that had first caught Emma's attention years ago. The bears, now fully grown, never lost their connection to their eagle guardian, often gathering beneath her favorite perches as if sharing stories of their latest adventures. One crisp autumn morning, 10 years after the first rescue, Emma stood on her cabin deck with Thomas, both of them now sporting more gray hair, but the same wonder in their eyes. Below them, in a sunny meadow, they could see Storm, Mist, and Echo teaching their own cubs to look to the sky, while Shadow watched from above, her golden feathers gleaming in the early light. "You know," Thomas mused, "when I first started working these mountains, I thought I had nature all figured out. Predator and prey, natural order, everything in its proper place." He smiled, shaking his head. "I've never been so glad to be wrong." Emma nodded, thinking of all the scientific papers she hadn't written, all the extraordinary moments she'd witnessed but kept private. Some things, she had learned, were too precious for academic dissection. Sometimes the greatest scientific contribution was simply to observe and protect, to bear witness to the endless capacity for love and adaptation in the natural world. "They rewrote the rules," she said softly, watching as Shadow took flight once more, her 3 unlikely children raising their heads to follow her movement, their own cubs mimicking the gesture. "But maybe the rules were never as rigid as we thought. Maybe nature has always been about connection, about finding family in the most unexpected places." Above them, Shadow's cry echoed across the valley, answered by a chorus of bear vocalizations that sounded remarkably like eagle calls. It was a sound that defied classification, much like the family that created it. a harmony of unexpected notes that somehow created its own perfect music. In the years that followed, the story of Shadow and her bears would be told and retold, growing perhaps in the telling. But those who knew them, who had witnessed their extraordinary journey firsthand, understood that the truth was more remarkable than any embellishment. They had demonstrated that love knows no species, that family can be found in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the greatest act of survival is reaching across boundaries to help another living being. The legacy they created lived on in the mountains, in the bears who looked to the sky for guidance, in the eagles who watched over creatures they once would have hunted, and in the hearts of all who witnessed their remarkable story. It served as a reminder that in a world often divided by differences, the capacity for love and connection remains the most powerful force in nature. And somewhere in the Bitterroot Mountains, if you listen carefully on a misty morning, you might still hear it, the cry of an eagle answered by bear calls, a family's song echoing across the wilderness, reminding us that the most extraordinary miracles often begin with a simple act of compassion.